the poet is the priest of the invisible. And I've always kind of loved that, and maybe we need more priests of the invisible right now. People that explore those things that most people just fly by, and it's that we don't notice the beauty around us because we're so absorbed in our fast-paced day-to-day lives. And I think that's one of the things a poet can do.
A door is open or closed. A door that's open is a hole toward space. A door that's closed, part of the wall, marks off space. If it moves, it is a door. So I am a door.
Now, many of you probably already know that this show debuted in the first week of May of 2010. It, Finding a Voice, has had the pleasure of weekly airing literary events, readings, book launches, and interviews. What you might not know is that I came into the radio station about 2.5 years before that as a guest and fell in love with the place and the people, and shortly after wanted to become involved as a volunteer, doing anything I could to help. I'd already been attending a number of literary happenings in and around Kingston, and what struck me was the wealth of literary talent in this community and the number of other great writers and poets from outside wanting to include Kingston in their travels and share their work. And I felt it all needed a larger audience, and I approached CFRC with an idea for a show. Thanks for tuning in to Finding a Voice here on CFRC 101.9 FM. My name is Bruce. I'm here every Friday afternoon from 4 to 6 o'clock. Sadiqa de Meir's poems have appeared in Poetry magazine and were awarded the CBC Poetry Prize. Her book, Leaving Howe Island, was nominated for the Pat Lowther Memorial Award and the Governor General's Literary Award. I visited with Sadiq at her home in the Skeleton Park neighborhood, and she shared her writing process for her poem, January.
So I was living in an apartment on Wellington Street, and things are just feeling really gray everywhere, as they can in a Kingston winter. The sky's overcast and the snow has maybe gotten a little gray too. So I was feeling this grayness all around. Then I had a downstairs neighbor who was a really heavy smoker, to the point where often smoke would kind of pour out of his basement window. One day, someone must have called the fire department. So a fire truck showed up. And what I remember about that moment, I must have known that it wasn't actually an emergency because I wasn't worried. But I just remember that burst of color being so great. Like that day, just to see this big red truck appear in the midst of all the gray, I was like, that is what I needed, you know? And then one day, much later, I was taking a walk later in the winter, and I saw a fox on the ice at the lake. And that it was really beautiful, you know, to see this bright animal on the ice. And then I thought, okay, that's actually the image. Like, that's what that poem's been waiting for. And so I went home and I wrote that. I took the gray part of the pre-existing material and I took out the fire truck and I put in the fox, and that's how that poem came to be.
January. Limestone buildings on limestone, alkaline walls to scull along, as the porous body in a cold-soaked coat, taped headphones. No need to squint, because the sky is embedded with mortar and fossils. Red fox at the bottom of Cataraqui Street, where the mill was and the tires and shrubbery are. Agile, shifty listener to its own brass solo, taking such a generously unlinear while over the lake ice to disappear.
The longest journey we will ever make in this lifetime is from your head to your heart. We're brought up in a society where you have to think all the time. It's hard to break out of that mode, and I know I didn't always write poetry the way I write poetry now. I mean, my poetry looks, from way back, looks completely different. And it was stumbling on that concept from Ray Bradbury about not thinking and just allowing and then writing. That's the process I try to teach. I've never thought of myself as a creator of poetry. I'm more a translator or transcriber. I'm the conduit or the pen. I'm just writing down what I hear coming out.
I was reminded of a interview that Stuart Ross had done with Bruce that appeared in Stuart's Further Confessions of a Small Press Racketeer. This is what Bruce had to say. For me, at an open mic, and in each poem, I try to hear three things that really have nothing to do with quality. They are seed, voice, and heart. What thing, in its own time, that touched the poet enough to pick up the pen at all, the sound it was heard in, and the place within that wishes to share the words and the message. And I just think that's really beautiful, because a lot of times you go to a poetry reading and everyone's just kind of, there's always this sort of judgment that's happening. People are trying to find good poetry, bad poetry, but Bruce will just sit there and listen, and somebody could be reading for the first time ever. They could have written a poem on a napkin earlier that day and brought it in, but if there's something in it that is coming from their heart, to everybody else it might not be a great poem, but to Bruce, he still really loves it, and I think that that's so important.
Kingston writer Stephen Heighton's most recent books are the novel The Nightingale Won't Let You Sleep and The Waking Comes Late, which won the 2016 Governor General's Award for Poetry. We met at the Skeleton Park Arts Festival to discuss whether poetry comes from the head or the heart.
If a poem doesn't have some kind of emotional valence, to me it's not interesting. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can write that kind of poem. I just won't be interested. The poem can be intellectual, it can be conceptual, mm-hmm. It can be from the head on that level, it can be ideological, politically mm-hmm. motivated, but it's got to also have some emotion. If it doesn't have emotion, I'd just rather, if you're trying to convince me of some intellectual fact or some ideological principle, mm-hmm. I'd rather read your essay than hear it in a poem. If there's some way to sort of fuse that intellectual energy with some emotional valence, then you might have a poem and I'll want to read it. Diving beyond the light, the swimmer carries the sun down with her as a dimming nimbus of heat on skin, or trapped under the cap with her hair.
Diving beyond the light, the swimmer carries the sun down with her as a dimming nimbus of heat on skin, or trapped under the cap with her hair. As sun-warmed air in the soft tanks of her lungs,
a thermal reserve in that minor star of moody hydrogen, her heart.
As sun-warmed air in the soft tanks of her lungs, a thermal reserve in that minor star of moody hydrogen, her heart.
As if she might colonize and humanize these depths any more than deep space. As if this time, despite quantum odds, after how many dives, she might be able to stay.
As if she might colonize and humanize these depths any more than deep space. As if this time, despite quantum odds, after how many dives, she might be able to stay.
Evolve in one lunge like the ancestral monster portrayed in musty biotexts.
Evolve in one lunge like the ancestral monster portrayed in musty biotexts.
Old, panting pioneer who flippers up onto land. Proto-mammal who returns to the waves, switching elements as simply as changing a dress. And at times, in dreams, you do the same. Find yourself flying, atoned in the upper air, or a guild thing plying a placental abyss beyond gravity,
And at times,
grave,
in
or
dreams,
ego,
you do
the
the
full
same.
sorrow of self-knowing,
Find
or a
yourself
guild thing
flying,
plying a placental
atoned in the
abyss
upper air,
beyond gravity,
or a guild
grave,
thing
or
flying
ego,
a placental
the full
abyss.
sorrow of self-knowing,
And at times, in dreams, you do the same.
at least until waking, when, yet again, you birth yourself back up onto shore.
He was very welcoming and encouraging of everybody. I remember at that open mic night, he wanted anybody and everybody to come up and read their poems. And I was at a point where I wasn't comfortable doing that because I'd never done it, and I just was sort of testing out the environment and the scene. I was really encouraged by how Bruce was with people. Just really easygoing. He has that smile and his warm kind of fuzzy gray hair and just an easy presence about him that makes people comfortable and also want to join whatever he's doing.
What Bruce is so great at is looking at a large picture and saying, oh, that means to me right there. He's perspicacious. Yeah, he seems to have a sort of big picture of what a healthy literary scene looks like.
Then he did this anthology, That Not Forgotten, which came out from Hidden Brook in 2012. Anyone who wanted to be in it could submit its literary community between covers as Finding a Voice is a literary community on radio. In both cases, it's open to everyone, and it's a space to write, it's a space to perform, and it's a space for those of us who write to be aware of other people's work, which is really good because we write from our community, whatever our community is, and this reminds us that our community is pretty broad.
Armand Garnett Ruffo was born in Chapleau, Northern Ontario, and draws on his Ojibwe heritage for his writing. He's been recently published in a number of anthologies and journals. Other publications include an introduction to Indigenous literary criticism in Canada that was published by Broadview in 2016. The Thunderbird Poems, Harbor Publishing, 2015, and Norval Morceau, Man Changing into Thunderbird.
The piece that I wrote is called On the Day the World Begins Again, and it's specifically about incarceration and the incarceration of Indigenous peoples. And as some may know and some may not know, Indigenous peoples are 10 times more likely to end up incarcerated than general Canadians. The rates of incarceration for Indigenous women have continued to climb. So we have some major issues there, and it has to do with colonialism, it has to do with disempowerment, it has to do with all the baggage that has come with colonialism. And for me, I really need to write about things that matter to my people, matter to Canadians in general, matter to the world. I mean, incarceration is a huge issue, and it's usually the disenfranchised, the poor, those people who don't necessarily fit in society, and society feels that they can simply, push them to the side. And so I felt very impressed to write something that mattered. So when Clark Mackey, the filmmaker, approached me, he wanted to look through my material that already existed. And I said, look, I'm in Kingston here. Let me write something about Kingston, and specifically, let's talk about incarceration. So the question is, what will happen on the day the world begins again? On the day the world begins again, will it be the strongest animal, the swiftest bird, or the tiniest insect that carries the news to humankind, announces rebirth in a roar, in a squeak, or maybe in silence? On the day the world begins again, will luminous light rise from parting clouds in unquestionable power and refract a miraculous prism of color, while the tallest white pine announces peace in a sprinkling of communion? On the day the world begins again, will those suspended behind bars, in and between gray ugliness, in their deadened shouts of protest, float beyond their circle of cigarette burns and crude tattoos? Beyond their sharp cries of where they are and wish they were. On the day the world begins again, will their reimagined selves, the shape of thought, the shape of prayer, bend like molten steel in the fire at the center of the human heart? Will they rise beyond themselves, find their way home? On the day the world begins again, will the cages open for them?
The word just kind of spread that there was a lot of things going on and that I might be someone that could help line up readings and launches. And so occasionally there are publishers that it's hard when they're either out of the city or especially out of province to try to line things up. I offer to help set it up, and then I put up flyers and a Facebook event notice and invite people and just try to get the word out. I have to credit everything that's happened around me opening the door to all those people that had the appetite and the desire and just need a venue to express that in. And you are listening to Finding a Voice here on CFRC 101.9 FM. Today's guest in studio is, I guess, the newly appointed Kingston Poet Laureate, Jason Heroux. Jason's going to discuss his poem, Black Trampoline.
And language is what we use to help define ourselves, and sometimes it doesn't quite connect with other people, you know. We have our reality, people have their reality, we have our language, other cultures have their language. And sometimes, these days especially with all the fake news and it doesn't seem like people are connecting. It seems like people are just talking to themselves. Black trampoline. Black trampoline. In our language, we call language language. We call a car in the garage a car in the garage. We call the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street. We invade the invaded in our language. We attack the attacked. We say things in our language we don't understand. We call you, you. We call our light switch our light switch. What do you call your language in your language? Do you call yourself yourself? Do you call your light switch your light switch? I fell asleep on the couch dreaming of your lemon trees. Do people dream of my lemon trees where you live? We have shadows in our language that need your help being shadows. We feel joys in our language that need your help to be felt. Do you need our help in your language? In your language? The puddles in our language take raindrop pills to fall asleep. What kind of pills do puddles take in your language? It's Sunday afternoon. Do you have Sunday afternoons where you live? You're like Sunday mornings, but later. A new wind is wine to the drunken tree in our language. A new death is wine to the drunken dust. Can you spare a dead fly for the spider in your language? Can you spare a small crumb for the broom? Now and then we borrow a breath from the air in our language. We borrow a bite from the apple. What do you feed a hungry grain of sand in your language? What do you feed a falling autumn leaf? What do you feed the month of October where you live? What do you feed a rusted pair of scissors? We feed our sand to the month of October in our language. We feed our leaf to the scissors. Sometimes the milk in our language expires and needs to be dumped out. Everything we buy needs to be assembled in our language. Every week the litter box in our language needs to be changed. In our language, everyone hungers for food no one hungers for. Everyone talks in our language about things no one talks about. The gray factory smoke in our language looks like a used condom littering the sky's sidewalk. Do you have the color gray in your language? It's like the color white, but darker. We call China Lake grenade launchers in our language China Lake grenade launchers. We call Donald Duck Donald Duck. In our language, we call telephones on the telephone. How do you call telephones in your language? What do you call China Lake grenade launchers where you live? I fell asleep watching television in our language, and then woke up and carried the garbage in our language to the curb. Do you carry garbage to the curb where you live? Do you have plastic bags in your language? They're like paper bags, but live longer. Reality is so realistic in our language. You actually have to cast a shadow in our language to cast a shadow. You must peel an orange just to peel an orange. There are so many people, places, and things that have disappeared in our language. Has anything disappeared in your language? We are so bewildered here. Are you bewildered where you live? Everyone in our language goes for a walk no one goes on. Every flower chirps in its cage. Every bird blossoms in its pot. In our language, everyone wants what no one wants. Everyone bounces up and down in our language. On a black trampoline, no one bounces up and down on.
And you are listening to Finding a Voice here on CFRC 101.9 FM. Thanks for tuning in. Sarah Chiang is the author of the poetry book Status Update, which was nominated for the Pat Lowther Award, and the Gerald Lampert Award-winning Sweet Devilry. She has been widely anthologized in such collections as Best Canadian Poetry 2013, Poet to Poet, and the Newborn Anthology. She is also the editor of the poetry collection Desperately Seeking Susans.
I wrote the poem because I was looking for sympathy cards, and when I was going through all of the kind of things that you normally say to the bereaved, it really brought home that we're not honest when it comes to death, and we don't talk about how it actually feels to lose somebody that you love. So I wanted to write about that. When the filmmaker Elisa came to my house to discuss what we were going to do with the film, she told me about the death of her own father, and that's something that we had in common, and it was part of the fuel for my poem. So what she decided to do actually was to have her own mother's voice talking about her grandfather. I think there's some bits about her father in there too, and we got some pictures of my own father and me in the film as well. So that's the film is really about how even when we're talking about a specific loss, there's that universal feeling of love and grief that anybody can relate to.
My father died 81 years ago in a car accident. one winter as he was returning from Trenton to Ottawa. I was a year old and my brother was 2.5. Recently, I got all my mother's scrapbooks from my brother to try to learn something about my father. I learned about how he was very highly respected and had a big military funeral in Ottawa.
If I were honest. Look through the sympathy cards, pastels, oceans, and clouds. Eloquent peace, God, appeals to your sense of faith. What a poverty of words. If I were honest, I tell you that you will never get over this grief. You are damaged. His death is a wide wound that will fester. Healing means new skin, scars, an ache in the body, when it rains or snows or when age sets in. And we know more by our loss than our remaining senses. Every time we access a memory, we change it. The people we have lost become distant echoes of our own voices every time we try to name them. We make poor copies of those we loved. What's left to us are those copies, hundreds of tattered revisions, torn pages over and over again. His face, his face, his face.
I don't have any memories. My mother brought us up. We were too young to understand, therefore she didn't talk to us. Somehow you don't talk about someone you didn't know, and if you don't know them, you don't really miss them. His face, his face, his face.
I became passionate about it in probably the early 90s when I started going to poetry readings and workshops and writing groups. Going to readings is just key. I think there's kind of a synergy that's created, and there are just ideas that not necessarily what the poet had talked about, but it spurs itself off some other thing. It shoots off somehow or something and becomes an idea on its own. It's like a spark.
I first met Bruce at Poetry at the Artel. I was amazed at the way, senior poets would come from our community and read, as well as students from the English department here, people from North Kingston, people with mental health issues. Everyone was there, and so interesting. It was just one of these nexus where so much happens, and everyone, because of the way Bruce worked, everyone was welcomed equally. We recruited him here at the Arts Center in a reception role, and he helps bring a special touch to the welcome visitors receive here at the gallery. A number of times people have, at events, taken me aside and said, "Who's that man at the reception desk?" And I'll say, which man do you mean, kind of half knowing, and I'll say, oh, that's Bruce. But they are convinced that he is a major celebrity of some kind, that they have seen somewhere and they can't quite place him.
Fernando Monte is an independent filmmaker, and he says his films resemble family pets around the house. Some of them need to be tamed, some only need a color to be taken for a walk and to be seen. When he says he's not filming, he writes books. And he spends much of his days, he says, in cafes trying to separate the significant from the insignificant, and that's where I caught him, at his home cafe near Skeleton Park. And he shared his thoughts on writing and how that relates to his passion for film.
Being so-called an avant-garde filmmaker, I hate to use the word experimental because it's not. Do you want to get down? Do you want to get down? Okay, you can get down. There you go. Good girl. No one gives you money to make films that nobody wants to see, so-called art films. So, and I wanted to express myself, and I thought if I cannot afford to buy a roll of film or to make this into a short film, I will write it as a poem. So that's how it began. I think my first poem in my first book, I think I was 17 when I wrote it, and that was supposed to be a short film, and I couldn't afford to do it, so I wrote the poem. I found an old photograph inside a forgotten book. In it, time had stopped, like a beautiful mystery, best untouched. The walls were white and naked. Above the unmade bed hung our favorite Mondrian print. Which seemed to carry youthful hope. With all its colors to infinity. To the left, on a windowsill, where the sun invaded every morning, stood the blue vase filled with dried flowers. Beyond was the avenue of solitary trees. Along which we had walked and left. On the submerged shadows. "20 years have passed, and I stare at an ancient world where dreams both bewildered and paralyzed us with incomprehensible forces. The camera, sad and automatic, failed to capture those internal emotions. Perhaps the boulevard where we walked and you cried like a wounded angel while I collected your tears still has its share of lovers. More photographs will be taken to become faded. As did our relationship, to vanish totally someday, blending into the colors of the Mondrian print.
Bruce Kauffman and Finding the Voice coming up next on CFRC and 101.9 FM. Remember, you can vote online, cfrc.ca, and give us your pledge, or you can also phone 533-2372 or come in person at Crothers Hall. I'm Rick Jackson. Until next time, so long for now for Music and Memories of the Artists and Music of the 20th Century.
It just happens to be that, you can barely throw a brick down the street without hitting a poet. We have a lot of readings in the store. I mean, it seems to me that we're doing more and more. A lot of it's got to do with Bruce doing that, because basically you've got to look at Bruce as being the stage manager for poets. They become comfortable and they see other poets, other prose writers, and they realize that, it's a comfortable scenario. And part of the reason it's comfortable is because, Bruce is the host. He's basically part of the store now. We sell a lot of poetry, and part of the reason is that poets buy poetry. I don't view the literary world as being in upheaval. It's actually, I think, kind of stable. People are buying books, people are writing books. It's 10 years ago, there was this, we were all running around, the sky was falling. But no, didn't fall. Books are here. They're going to stay. And people are going to write them, and people are going to read them. And same with poetry.
There was this weird divide between my boyfriend calls it the old community and the young community, where the open mic and the art fest stuff always tends to be this older generation of poets. And then I kind of got into Andrea Prin's The Poetry Collective events and the Queen's Poetry Slam, and that always seemed to be the younger crowd, and there was no real crossover. But I've actually noticed the last year and a half or so, people have been bridging the gap, which has been really great to see. There was always this amazing community with so many opportunities, and now the two halves of it seem to be coming together, and it's just getting even better.
Hey Joan, how are you? Fine. It's been a long time. It's good to see you again. Are you going to read tonight or just here to listen?
Well, I hadn't let you know ahead of time. I thought a three-liner and a couple of short ones.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, that sounds wonderful.
There are so many opportunities for performances and readings now, and I think Bruce Kauffman has been central in making that kind of thing happen.
Oh, finally I get to put a face to the name. Are you gonna perform tonight? Yeah. Sign-up sheets here, it's filling up.
Bruce never seems to get burned out and is managing to run an entirely different kind of group of performances than anyone has ever done before. Bruce creates a completely safe space and a supportive, kind space where he allows all kinds of creativity to blossom, and that's so important. I hope that the community will continue to grow through this tremendous freedom that we have now, where people realize that poetry can do anything, can be anything. And however you want to translate that, whether that be through online publishing or poetry films or chapbook publishing, or however you're going to do it, just know that you don't have any boundaries, that you can do whatever it is you want to do, and that's valid.
And thanks for tuning into the second hour of Finding a Voice here on CFRC 101.9 FM. My name is Bruce. Alyssa Cooper is a poet, author, and performer based in Kingston, Ontario, author of 4 novels, a short story collection, and 2 poetry collections, as well as having her work included in numerous anthologies, zines, and literary journals. I met with Alyssa at the NGB studios, and she talked to me about her poem, Gendered.
The idea that you can step outside the binary really just has come to the forefront, and that's been really freeing for me. This idea that I don't have to identify as a man or a woman. I still use female pronouns, I'm comfortable with them, but I'm also comfortable with they, them. I just don't insist upon it. And I'm comfortable being called a girl, but not comfortable being called a woman, and comfortable being called a boy, but not comfortable being called a girl, which is all very confusing. But yeah, I never really felt comfortable with my identity until I realized that I didn't have to throw it in one category or the other. It could sit right there in the middle. And that's what the piece is about, that kind of journey and exploration.
When I was young, I ran in a pack, like a wolf. I kept pace with the beasts on either side of me, and we were wild animals, howling at the moon and screaming like warriors. We scaled hills and trees and chain-link fences, bathing in sweat under the hot summer sun. We took hold of the world, and we made it our own. We turned our reality into fantasy. We scrambled up jungle gyms like shipmasts, tattooing our palms with rain-rotted paint. We conquered the crow's nest and stared down into an ocean of possibility. Fervent in victory, my wolves pulled off their shirts and held them out to the wind like flags. They declared themselves pirates, with their narrow chests bared to the sun, kings of the 7 seas. But when I reached for my own hem, they stopped. They dropped their eyes, dropped their flags, hid their crowns, and insisted. Girls can't take their shirts off. Allowed to howl, allowed to run and scream and jump, but there in the crow's nest, my pack drew the line. With their matching chest ribbed like washboards, those boys taught me shame, taught me indignity, taught me to fear the breasts that didn't even exist yet, left me counting my ribs in the mirror and wondering what it was that made me something else. Made me wonder why I couldn't be a pirate. Spent the years that followed in compounded confusion, struggling through the overexposed fever dream of puberty. Days spent draped in t-shirts 3 sizes too big, nights spent binding my budding chest, wrapped in bandages until I could barely breathe, admiring my reclaimed flatness. Studied the girls in their heels and skirts and lipsticks like an archaeologist struggling to make sense of an ancient civilization. Deciphered the hieroglyphics of gender and found no meaning in those jumbled abstract symbols. Saw the blood between my legs and quaked in horror at the thought of being labeled woman. And so I sheared the hair from my head. I laced up heavy combat boots, cast aside femininity. I turned all of my curves into corners, determined to be hard, determined to be sharp. I made myself into an overdrawn caricature, opposing every expectation. And in the end, found that the costume of masculinity didn't fit either. Couldn't make a home in a man, couldn't make a home in a woman, couldn't make a home in my own skin until the day that I realized that labels were meant to be transcended. Either, neither, both. It was breaking the binary that finally freed me. Untangled the fishing line that had strangled my gills, unlocked the shackles at ankle and wrist, let me spread my wings, rush the surface, and finally accept the multiplicity of my identity. I never hated my curves, these hips and breasts, just hated the things that they represented. I never hated my monthly blood, that bone-deep connection to the pull of the moon, just hated the expectation that came with it. I never hated the femme, the butch, the hard, the soft, never hated the dresses, never hated the makeup, the bald head, the heavy boots, just hated the lines that they drew in the sand at my feet. I never hated this body, this beautiful, wonderful, undefinable body, just hated the way that the wolves chose to look at it.
And I don't know how it works, if you start the music or you wait till we start. Okay. And do you want me to read through all of the poems or are we just getting an idea? All of it? Okay.
Both the sort of official, the Kingston Writers Fest, and the unofficial, the stuff that Bruce does, is all working together to help develop writers, to help them find their voice, to help them find a platform. The festival gives a platform, and we always program local writers, including local poets and all genre, debut writers and poets. And so that's an amazing first experience for a writer to be exposed to a professional setting and a large public for their work. So I think that's the kind of leg up that that both Bruce's work and our work, there's a collaboration there, you know, a nice intersection.
I don't think most people know, but I'm really kind of a recluse of sorts. I prefer the quietness often, being alone with my pen and journal, but it is the family, I guess, of poets. That bond is strong enough and great enough that it pulls me out of being alone and sitting with myself. It takes a lot to draw me out into the public, so that should be some indication, I guess, of how strong that familial bond is in this beautiful poetry community we have here in Kingston. Helen Humphreys is the author of 4 books of poetry, 8 novels, and 4 works of creative nonfiction. She lives in Kingston. I met with Helen, and we're actually going to wrap up our show with Helen Humphreys and her poem, Limestone. Thanks for listening to Finding a Voice here on CFRC.
I did the poem Limestone as part of my poet laureate thing for the city of Kingston, where I have to produce 1 original poem a year. But I was thinking about what I wanted to do was to try and make a creation myth for Kingston. And so I was thinking, like, how could I do that? What would I talk about? And I thought, what is the thing that kind of we all have in common living here is that we have some connection to or limestone. I started in that sort of run it like a story, right? Before the wind, before the animals, like this idea of trying to get at how old limestone is and how we're actually at the bottom of this ancient sea, which I find really kind of interesting.
Before the animals, before the green stutter of trees, fragrant hum of flowers, there was wind. Before wind, there were the mountains. Shedding their skins for 500 million years until they were islands. Before the mountains was the sea, shallow with sediment, sloughed off minerals, and the skeletons of coral and mollusk compressing into rock. Limestone, the building blocks of this city. Each gray wall of Kingston, a congress of dead sea creatures from the ancient slip and spill. each stone older than human life. Our lives that blow through brief as weather. On the surface of these streets, these rock shelves, this old mountain, this furrowing, living sea.
I will swear by this until the end of time. I just consider myself the doorman. I have found in this town that there's an appetite for things, and if you just open the door, find a way to open the door, that people just swarm in. The door is open or closed. A door that's open is a hole towards space. A door that's closed, part of the wall, marks off space. If it moves, it is a door. So I am a door.